Hi, everyone, and welcome again to GaudimusBiz22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. I am very, very pleased to have with me today someone I've never met in person, and yet I got to know him. I'm not ashamed to say it. I got to know him through social media. I got to know him through various Facebook posts, and I was always extremely impressed with what he had to say on Facebook. Very measured and yet very insightful, deeply theological. I thought, well, I need to get this guy on my show. And so here he is. And I'm speaking none other than, and a lot of you are familiar with him, Father Peter Totleben, who goes simply by Father Peter. And I'm going to just read a very brief biography. Father Peter entered the Eastern Province of the Dominican Order in 2006 and made his solemn vows in 2012. In 2016, he was ordained to the priesthood. Currently, he's studying for his doctorate at the Angelicum, the Dominican University in Rome, where he is writing on God's freedom in Aquinas and in contemporary theologians. That is a very interesting topic. I certainly dealt with that when I was writing my dissertation on von Balthasar and his unique understanding of the Trinitarian nature of God's freedom. Maybe we can get into that later just a bit. But anyway, so welcome to the show.
Sure. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Yeah, like I said, I've seen all the great things that you've done as well. I've seen all the other guests that you have on your podcast, and I have to admit, I'm a little bit humbled to be here with you, to be in such august company.
Well, you've earned it. And I'm looking forward to great things from you in the future. Hopefully your dissertation will get published someday, because it sounds like an eminently fascinating topic. But anyway, as I said, I've been following you on Facebook and you, me, and we've had some interactions on there. But so many of your posts, it seemed to me, struck such a fine balance between both a criticism of the current papacy, as I have offered, but also, avoiding the worst kinds of over-the-top criticisms, I like to say, and offering a very measured and sober theological response, as well as, I think, in your posts, a rather deep analysis of the state of the church. And so I would kind of like to sort of begin there. You're a young guy, okay? By the way, where are you originally from?
Oh, I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania.
Oh, you're a Pennsylvania guy.
I am a Pennsylvania guy.
All right. Well, I'm in northeastern PA, NEPA, as they call it.
Other side of the state, but
Yeah. Yeah. And you're up there right on. My dad's from Toledo, Ohio, so I know Lake Erie well.
Sure.
Yeah. On the other end of Lake Erie. So, okay. And Erie, Pennsylvania guy. But at any rate, so you're a relatively young guy. So I always like to ask people far younger than I am, especially if they're priests. What is your take on the current state of the church? Let's just start with because I know a lot of my viewers and listeners, they all have their own sort of point of view right now. The church is either going to hell in a handbasket, or it's, hey, everything's great, we've never had it better. And then others who just shrug their shoulders and say, oh, same as it ever was. So what's your take on things?
Well, I think there's just a mixture of light and shadows, when we look at the church, first of all, like the church is 1.1 billion people. I think that's the most realistic observation you can make about the church, right? It's 1.1 billion people, so that at any time, just about everything is going on. Immediately before I got here in Rome, I was working in Columbus, Ohio. I was kind of teaching the seminary, doing some other pastoral ministry there. And I was having a really great experience of the church, So I've been familiar with like a lot of really vibrant things that are going on in the church. So my situation in Columbus was great. I did some work with Focus, just absolutely wonderful. So like what I like to say about the church is it's very hard to say like, oh, there's something that's really bad or there's something that's really good. It's that there's all sorts of stuff that's going on. And I think that like, when we think about the church, it's most important to think about like her activity as a whole. I wouldn't want to be, it's not, the church is more than just like the hierarchy, but it's all this positive stuff that's going on. So when you look at things that are happening in the American Catholic Church, or at least in my context, I think there's a lot of really wonderful stuff going on. There's a lot of evangelically powerful people. a lot of powerful evangelism going on. There's a lot of exciting apostolates. There's really a lot of dynamism.
Yeah.
We look at, sort of in the ecclesiological circles or the church circles that I float in when we pass to the hierarchy, there's a certain amount of, there's a certain amount of despair. But I think sometimes, like like kind of the online culture that we have tends to get us into sort of like this feedback loop with respect to despair, So
Yeah.
sometimes people complain about like different controversies or things that are happening, but I think it's important to be realistic about, things. But I think it's also important to see like all of the good things that are happening. I mean, look at the Eucharistic revival in the church that we're going through right now. I mean, think about people nowadays who think that like the battle days are returning. Well, in the real battle days, there wasn't like a Eucharistic revival. You know what I mean? We weren't having cross-country Eucharistic processions, right? But that's like considered like a normal part of American Catholic life now. I was just doing some work on catechetical materials for like a little other project that I do. And I was comparing like the catechetical materials, and like the catechesis that goes on in our church now is way better than it was when, say, I was in high school or grade school. The
Certainly for me. Yeah, certainly
yeah, the period of time where they were like, the Holy Spirit is a dove. Here, children, color the picture of the dove. And then now you learned about the Holy Spirit, this
we made little collages of cutouts from magazines of poor kids in Africa or poor kids in the Bronx, and Jesus loves them, and we'd paste them up on a whiteboard, white cardboard. That was my catechism class.
Yeah, you got to realize. Now, I was fortunate. Like, I went to a pretty good Catholic high school. It's I grew up in sort of like the last whiff of that, like the old ethnic Catholic system. Like, I mean, it was very, very, very almost gone by the time I was young, going through school. But it was sort of like that last of that environment. So, like, I think my high school, what changed between 1965 and 1995 was that in 1995 blazers were optional, and in 1965 they were required. This kind of thing. So we actually depending on who you got for like theology, I was actually blessed with good theology teachers. As a matter of fact, I guess like in retrospect, thinking about my Dominican vocation, I remember sitting in 10th grade. We had a sacraments class, and we just had a priest, and he to be honest, he wasn't like a particularly dynamic priest, but he was a competent teacher, and he just kind of taught us. He just kind of said, "Hey, this is what grace is." And I just remember thinking in class like that's what we believe in our faith. And then I was like, oh, then I have to live my life differently. And I feel like if you're sitting in a theology class and have a revelation about grace, that's like a foreshadowing of a Dominican vocation. But
Yeah. I like to point at what happened between 1978 and 1995, what happened was John Paul II.
Absolutely.
And the issuing of the Universal Catechism of the Catholic Church.
Absolutely.
And I think that accounts for a lot of the increase of the quality of the catechesis, was the issuing of that catechism.
Oh, absolutely. There's also like our bishops have done like a wonderful job in normalizing the use of the catechism and standardizing the use of the catechism. So now, I mean, we have this Catechism in a Year podcast that's going on now. We have we have like just about any catechetical book you buy, like whatever your criticisms of it might be, I mean, some are always better or worse than others or take a different perspective, but they're all like, the consensus is that the Catechism of the Catholic Church is the norm for catechesis, which was not the case, previously. So, I mean, there's lots of positive things, so I think it's just always important to kind of highlight that. Because we like to get into all the it's very easy to get into all like the juicy stuff, but like, it's also just important to remember, like, our faith is about, at the end of the day, being conformed to Jesus Christ through the power of the Holy Spirit, and it's not about like what I almost said a different word. It's all not about what some goofball in the Vatican is doing or whatever. or like what some guy in like some office is doing, or like this latest little bit of political intrigue. At the end of the day, it's about worshiping God. It's about being conformed in God. It's about becoming a saint. And there's a lot of good stuff in that respect going on.
Yeah, there
And I
is.
think
And
that's
we,
important.
and we need to keep in mind too, and I've written a lot on these, what we call, inside baseball ecclesial issues, whether,
Yeah.
I was in Rome last October covering the Synod on synodality, and I've written, on fiducia supplicans and stuff like that. But the thing that we always, and I think it's important to write on those things, and I don't apologize for that. Nevertheless, it is important to keep in mind, and I always remind myself of this, that the vast majority of average Catholics have no idea about any of
Yeah.
that. I mean, I'm originally from Lincoln, Nebraska, and I went home and was visiting my family. And I was telling them that I was going to go to Rome in October to cover the Synod on synodality. And everyone in my family says, well, what's that? We've never
Yeah.
heard of that. And even though I know it was in their diocesan newspaper, and so on, but they don't read it. It may come in the mail, but they don't read it.
Yeah.
I don't even know if it comes in the mail anymore, so you have to go online to get it. I don't know, but that's the reality of it. So go ahead.
Well, no, I was not, because my mom is that way a lot too. She just kind of does her thing, like goes to church, does it, just does normal stuff. Uh, and so then periodically, like she'll hear something, and she's like, "Well, I've got this priest's son, so like I might as well ask him what's going on." And I remember like she heard something about Traditionis Custodes, and she didn't understand any of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so she just kind of goes like, she's like, "What's that all about?" And I try to give, like, I'm not gonna like radicalize my mother. So like I try to give about a by the numbers neutral explanation of what's going on. And she said to the effect of like, she's like, "So we've been trying for all these years to get people to go to church. Then when they go to church, we yell at them for going to the wrong kind of church." she's like,
Yeah.
and they have all these like rock and roll masses and stuff. But like, what if you wanted to do, if that's okay, why isn't that other one okay too?
Oh,
And dude,
that's a deeply insightful comment, if you ask me. And it's my number one
yeah,
criticism. I think it would be your criticism too, right? Of Traditionis Custodes, is that, okay, the traditionalist movement has problems, and I want to talk about that. It has
sure,
its
absolutely.
problems. But, let a thousand flowers bloom. It's a gorgeous liturgy. Some people really like it. And if we can have, you know, German Spartan brutalist minimalist masses in, Euro masses in Berlin, that, now is the time on sprockets when we dance and stuff like this.
I love the Sprockets reference.
Yeah. Now is the time on Dieter. Yeah, right.
Either,
From
yeah.
Saturday Night Live. From Saturday Night Live. Now is the time on sprockets when we dance. And sometimes you get this sense of this kind of brutalist, minimalist nonsense in German mass. If we can have that, why can't we have a traditional Latin mass
Well,
for a few people?
well, if you read Bugnini's book, right? So his book on the reform of the Roman liturgy, chapter 1 is on pastoral liturgy. And his claim is basically the fundamental guiding principle of the liturgical reform is what he calls pastoral liturgy. And by that, he defines it to be like taking stock of the needs and the spirituality of the local community, and sort of tailoring the liturgy to the sensitivities and the sensibilities of the local community. Well, okay, so if you want to admit that as a principle, it's a bit arbitrary than to say you're allowed to like whatever you want, and we'll tailor the liturgy to whatever principles that you like, or to whatever taste that you have, except for the 1700-year tradition of Catholic worship. The one thing you're not allowed to like is the way we used to worship God for 1700 years or something.
Yeah. And,
Like
and Bennett,
that's
go ahead.
no. I was just gonna say that's just sort of an evident contradiction. And you're gonna say, Benedict kind of pointed that out. Like, it's kind of a bit unhealthy to have like such a hatred of your own history.
And he said in Summorum Pontificum, right? What was once sacred cannot be held not to be sacred.
Yeah.
And the fact is, there are enemies of the traditional Latin Mass in very high places in the church who treat it not only as a kind of antiquarian curiosity that they have no interest in. they treat it as something dangerous and therefore not sacred. I
Yeah.
think one of the motivations behind Traditionis Custodes, I'm not saying from Pope Francis, but from some of his
Yeah.
allies, was let's stick it to the traditionalists because they're a pain.
Yeah. Oh no, no, certainly there's that. And I think that's actually too, I think that's actually a valuable point for when you analyze kind of like Pope Francis and everything else, like in the church. I think it's important to point out when we look at like large bureaucracies elsewhere, like in the government or something like that, we tend to like understand like say like the president of the United States presides over the federal bureaucracy, and we kind of like understand like how there there's different factions, and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense vie for influence over the. We understand like the politics of a bureaucracy, right? But then like when we pass to the church, everybody like loses their minds in trying to like analyze it, and it seems to me like there's a lot more. It's a lot more sensible to try to understand the church as like a bureaucracy that works with the sort of like kind of ordinary kind of politics that any bureaucracy works. It's like what Jesus said in the gospel, where two or three are gathered in my name, there's politics. So but like no,
Yeah.
it's just like human nature being what it is, people are going to interact. And so when you look at something like Traditionis Custodes, what you're going to see is you're going to see like the interaction of various circles around Francis vying for influence. And so you can't necessarily infer from like what the bureaucracy is doing, or like what different factions are doing directly to something like the mind of Pope Francis, right? Because like like the bureaucracy isn't just like a pure expression of his will. It's a mixture of different factions, sort of over which he's presiding and governing. So I think that's also like a helpful. It kind of helps to dial down the temperature a little bit. Where like we have to have like these like crazy conspiracies that it goes all the way to the top. And you can be like, no, it's just this is pretty much how bureaucracies work. And you can actually see this because an example is when Traditionis Custodes came out in July of 2021, but in December of 2020, the Congregation for Divine Worship was already adding prefaces, like they were taking Novus Ordo prefaces and making them available in the Latin Mass. So like if you're doing things like that, 7 months before you're going to like restrict the Latin Mass, clearly there, clearly those people weren't predicting anything like this to come about. And if it was like a serious thing, a priority for Francis himself, he wouldn't have waited until like what 8 years into his pontificate to do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
No, that's
Yeah.
not to say that there aren't valid criticisms, but like it kind of helps to dial down the temperature to be like, okay, like there's not some sort of grand thing. There are enemies of the traditional Latin Mass, right? And there are people who clearly hate it for their own reasons, because they have like their own understanding of how the church works and how like the church is progressing through time, and how like it's promoted by these reactionary elements, and in order to be the revolutionary vanguard for the way in the future, we need to put down the we need to destroy the material conditions for counter-revolution in order for like the new springtime to flourish and all of this. There are people who genuinely think that,
Yeah. I
but
mean,
like, oh
oh,
no,
go ahead.
there are people who genuinely think that, but like I wouldn't necessarily say that that's like monolithic either, you know. And so I think it's just helpful to have like that kind of like perspective.
Oh, that's definitely helpful, especially to remind ourselves that not everything that comes out of the Vatican, even with a papal signature, is necessarily directly expressive of that pope's mind, because there are political considerations that every pope has to make. I'm going to sign this document because I signed this other one last year out of
Sure.
this congregation, and that angered this other congregation. So now I'm going to make them, coincide with one another a little bit better, and so on. Or like I'm going to canonize. Let's see, I'm going to canonize John Paul, but I better canonize Paul VI at the same time.
Yeah,
that
yeah.
that
No, there's that. And it's just that the Pope Francis is finite. Like it's this weird. So like in fights in the church, what you have is this idea that like the Pope is like has superpowers, and then so like you have like sort of like the Pope's explainers who are like he has superpowers, therefore he's a superhero who always uses his superpowers for good. And then like you have like the really anti-Pope Francis people who are like, well, he has superpowers, and since bad things are happening, he's obviously a super villain who's using his superpowers to work villainy on the church. And you're like, well, he's actually just like a finite mind who can only work so many hours during the day, who can only like know so many things. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so like, I mean, a lot of his role is going to be delegated. Now that doesn't necessarily say he's not responsible for a particular decision that you don't like at all. But like at the same time, there's a little bit difference between like what Francis actually thinks, what the bureaucracy produces, and then sort of like what the people who glom onto Francis for the sake of their own agenda think
Yeah.
as well.
All that being said, I'm going to play devil's advocate here a little bit. And I don't want to get you in trouble or have you say
Yeah,
something that you maybe you don't want to say, but I'll play devil's advocate and say that's all true. Nevertheless, after a pope's been pope for a while, 10, 11 years now with this one, patterns can start to be discerned in terms
sure,
of who, personnel is policy. And
absolutely.
ultimately, who has he placed in charge of certain congregations? Like, he got rid of Cardinal Mueller, then allowed Ladaria to retire and puts in Cardinal Fernandez. And this is
Sure.
like a shock to the system. And in his, he overlooks Archbishop Gomez in Los Angeles for a red hat and gives it to a very liberal Cardinal McElroy from San
Yeah.
Diego instead. I mean, these are little tells, as we say in poker, that maybe you can read the mind of the Pope a little bit. So, like I said, I'm playing
Oh,
devil's advocate here. In
oh,
other
they
words,
certainly are. Yeah, no. So I would want to like maybe take a mediating position. I don't want to be like this idea of like, no, the czar, it's the czar. If the czar knew what was happening all the way in St. Petersburg, if the czar knew what was happening, he wouldn't approve of it. But this is just the local officials. The czar is, I don't want to say that. But I also don't want to say that like, everything is like sort of like directly masterminded by the Pope, right? So we can look at what the Pope does, and then like we can look at it with a critical eye, but not with like a sort of conspiratorial eye. And I
oh, I
actually
think,
think, that this is actually the best way to like assist people in fostering communion with the Pope too. So like I don't want to like because I really do want to make it clear that like I don't want to be seen as sort of like anti-papal or anti-Francis or something like that. But like what I see is that like sometimes there are some people who think that the way to the way to facilitate communion with the Pope and to like help people appreciate Pope Francis more is to go the full Kim Jong Un and like just double down on like the personality cult and say like no, you just have
yeah.
to have this big personality cult. What I've actually found pastorally is that like if you give like a more measured sort of like appreciation of the Pope, where you can kind of say like, okay, but like we can give him credit for this. Like, look what he says here, or look what he preached here. And then we can say like, okay, but then like there's this decision which I don't think was a good decision for this reason.
Right.
Like when you actually
Exactly.
do that, it takes the venom. So like the problem is that the more you do like the Pope splaining approach, the more you get the equal and opposite reaction of the papal villainy approach, and the more you do the papal villainy approach, you get like the Pope splaining approach, and they like feed off of each other. They
Oh,
just
they
go back
sure
and forth.
do. I love that
And like
distinction. Go ahead.
and then like, but then like, it actually turns out like if it went pastorally, like I've experienced this in my own pastoral ministry, because I do think it's important to facilitate communion. I mean, I feel like that's part of my job as a priest, as a religious. The Pope is my religious superior, so I feel like it's important to facilitate ecclesial communion, and the Pope is a touchstone of ecclesial communion. That doesn't necessarily mean that ecclesial communion is a personality cult, but the Pope really is a touchstone of ecclesial communion. And I find pastorally that like when you're able to actually like talk about Pope Francis like he's an ordinary human being tasked with this incredible responsibility, and then be able to say like, well, and tell people like, well, yeah, you're allowed to say this was good, this was bad, and to just kind of call balls and strikes, a lot of the like real like anger disappears, the real rebelliousness against the Pope disappears. What makes that rebelliousness worse is the sort of over defending. you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And so like if you provide a realistic evaluation of how you think of the Pope, and you're just honest and vulnerable about how you think of things, a lot of other people are able to say like, okay, right, so like I prefer John Paul or Benedict more, like that's my Pope. That's more my style of papacy. But like Francis is the Pope too, and I can look at that. I mean, and that's just the thing, right? You're just in a church, you're just there's 1.1 billion people, so you're never going to get, not every pope is going to think like you. And also too, for the pope is just got to expect that like in a church of 1.1 billion people, you're going to have critics. You can't have like 1.1 billion people all think exactly like you.
Well, that's true. And I like the distinction between, being critical, but not being conspiratorial. I mean, for example, I agree. I mean, John Paul was the ecclesial hero of my lifetime. I entered
Oh yeah.
seminary in 1978 when he was elected. He remains to this day sort of my great ecclesial hero and idol. But I also have criticisms to offer of him.
Sure.
I don't throw out conspiracy theories. I don't, say, oh, this pope was a heretic and a modernist. I wish he hadn't kissed a Koran. I wish he hadn't
Yeah.
done that Assisi thing. I wish he had a more hands-on control of the Vatican governance and things like the sex abuse crisis. So,
Yeah.
and I've offered those, but, with regard to this Pope, I've been very, very critical of this Pope, but I refuse to say in the conspiratorial, oh, he's a closeted Freemason, or he's formally taught heresy, he's a heretic.
Yeah.
These are kinds of over the, and so then once in a while the Vatican will put out something that I praise, like Justice Verbisque, which
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
thought
Yeah.
was an excellent document. And then people in the com box under my articles will say, "Oh, how foolish can you be? Don't you know that this was just part of the ruse to lull us into a false,
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
no, I'm not a fanboy of Pope Francis. He's not my favorite Pope. I think he has deep flaws. I'm very critical of, but he's not a heretic. He is the Pope. And I think it is very important that we find every avenue possible for remaining in communion with the Bishop of Rome. And
No, no, absolutely.
and the Pope splainers, like you said, don't help the matter any. When, for example, the African bishops rose up and said, we don't like fiducia supplicans. We don't like that. It's not going to play here. You had some of these American Pope splainers going on their YouTube channels and saying the Africans are flirting with schism because they're now dissenting from the papal magisterium. That's not schism. That's being critical of a papal action, and you're allowed to do that.
Yeah. 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 And that's the thing. It's this stakes raising attitude that's
Yeah.
that's unhelpful. And it really does, like both forms, like sort of like the extreme critics and sort of like the extreme personality cult sides, they're both forms of ways that are like rupturing communion, right? Um, what we want to get back to is, and like I always kind of make I always make the distinction with people that like what we owe the Pope are three things, right? Like when the Pope teaches doctrine, we owe an assent to it, according to the level of its teaching authority, right? Through assent. When there's an act of governance that pertains to us, we must follow it, right? So, for example, I'm not personally a fan. I mean, I think I have criticisms of Traditionis Custodes, but it's funny. It was actually here in Rome. It came out during the middle of the summer, so it's a little bit of a downtime. I was actually literally about to go celebrate the Dominican rite when I found out that Traditionis Custodes came out, right? And I read it to see what the rule was, and it's a little technical about whether the Dominican rite is allowed or not. But like there, I was like, well, you know what? I'm gonna follow. It looks like the intent. This is the intention here. I'm gonna follow the safe opinion, and so I followed the Novus Ordo instead because the Pope said these are the rules and they're effective immediately,
Yes.
right?
And
So Traditionis Custodes, the Pope made an act of governance, and I followed it, right? And then the third thing we owe is just a respect that's due to the office, right? That doesn't mean a personality cult, but it means when we have criticisms to talk about them in a respectful way, to try to find things that the Pope does that are good that we like. Like I always tell people, one thing that I like about the Pope is actually his preaching. It's actually usually pretty good. Like sometimes I get to go to papal masses here in because I'm in Rome, and then other times when you actually hear when he's in a more preachy mood, one of the things that he has an affinity for the concrete,
yeah.
right? that actually turns out very well in preaching. I always tell people that, like, if the Pope was preaching a retreat, I would actually go to the conferences, because I think they would actually be like interesting. You know what
Yeah,
I mean?
I think he's a very good homilist, and he's actually in some of the things that I've read that he's written. Uh, he can be he's very lyrical. He's very poetic,
Yeah,
and that is a result of the concreteness, as you say. And like I said, my issues are not with pretty much 99% of what this Pope has written
sure.
or preached in homilies. My problem has to do more with actions, with mainly the personnel that he has elevated to high office. That's what concerns me the most. But let's go ahead. You can finish your
No,
thought
I was
there.
gonna say, yeah, no, I think it's an entirely fair criticism to say that Pope Francis has been more of a destabilizing force than a pope should be, both in maybe some of his own acts of governance and in the people that he listens to, that he takes advice from, and the people that he appoints to offices. I would have to say that, like, his style of governance is very destabilizing, and I don't think that's a virtue in a pope.
Well, I like to say that one of the central functions, if not the most important function of the Petrine ministry, is to unify the church by being a point of clarification in disputed
Yes.
matters. Instead, he likes to muddy the waters and stir the pot, which I don't think is what a pope should do. But anyway,
Yeah.
we don't have to dwell completely at length on Pope Francis. I like what you have to say. I'm a critic of Pope Francis, and yet I like what you have to say because I try to be very, very circumspect, and I agree with you. For example, Traditionis Custodes, I'm opposed to it. Nevertheless, we have to obey it. And yet, I have traditionalist friends who say we need to start doing underground masses. We need to start having priests disobey the Pope. We need to have house masses going on where people will set up chapels in their basement for a priest to come and do the Tridentine liturgy so that we keep this liturgy alive. No, no, that is not the path of, I think, of building up the body of Christ.
Yeah, and not only do the ends not justify the means, I mean, right, you can't defeat Sauron by putting on the One Ring. The end just doesn't justify the means, right? It's not like they say that the Tridentine Mass is the Mass of the saints. That's not what a saint would do. None of the saints who love the Tridentine Mass would have saved it that way. And also, as a tactical move, um, maybe a central criticism I have of the traditionalist movement is they seem to think that sort of like intransigence, aloofness, and standoffishness has got them what they have. And I would say that it's actually what they have, they've gotten despite those characteristics. Like, the traditionalist movement would be a lot more successful if it tried to show how it was a part of the local church rather than an alternative to the local church.
Bingo. I attend an Anglican ordinariate parish because I love the liturgy so much. And people, traditionalists have said to me, well, you're next. He'll come after you guys next. And I said, no, he won't. And the reason why he won't is because we in the ordinariate have not weaponized our liturgy against the rest
Yeah,
of the church, as you guys have. All right.
yeah,
And I'm not blaming the victim here, but in some sense, yeah, they were their own worst
yeah.
enemy. Okay.
Well, if you hand someone who wants to kill you a gun and some bullets, it's wrong for them to shoot you, but you could have prevented them from shooting you by not handing them a gun and some bullets.
That's right. Like the
Also,
past. Go ahead.
well, also too, that's one point. And so like they kind of arm their enemies, but then they kind of alienate their allies, right? Like, and it's not a good idea. Like, a lot of times, and you just notice, like, in any, like, the priesthood is like this, like the community of priests in like any organization. A lot of times, like, when you have like these kind of backdoor channels, when you have like fraternal relationships with people, it makes it much easier to get things done. You know what I mean? Like, when
Yeah.
you have lines of communication open with people, it makes people much more favorable to you. It makes them much more easier to get done. When people say, like, "Oh, what now with these people?" Or do they say, "Oh, I always enjoy working with these people."
Yeah.
Like, it's the problem that they have, I think, is that if they would operate with more of a spirit of communion, they would get more of their desiderata.
Oh, I agree. I think that's a very insightful comment about not only aggravating their enemies but alienating their friends. Take someone like me. I'm a naturally conservative sort of guy who leans in a traditional way, and I love I love the old mass. I don't attend it, but I love it. And the fact is, I felt very alienated when I'd like go on social media and I'd go on a reputable traditionalist site, and they would start trashing Hans Urs von Balthasar as a universalist modernist.
Sure, yeah.
He's the reason why we're in this situation. De Lubac and Ratzinger are both modernists. John Paul was a modernist.
Well, and of course,
you know,
you know that none of them have read De Lubac on anything.
that's right.
They sort of read about De Lubac on the internet.
Yeah, I ask many of them, have you read Balthasar's book, Was dürfen wir hoffen? What may we hope for? Mistitled in English, Dare we hope? What are we allowed to hope for? In other words, Balthasar was saying we have to maintain within orthodoxy. What within the parameters of orthodoxy are we allowed to hope for with regard to the final disposition of all souls? And he saw in the church, in the scriptures and in the church tradition, that it is allowable to us, was dürfen wir hoffen, it is allowable to us to hope for the salvation of all. Now, this sends so many traditionalists right over the cliff. No, you can't hope for that which is impossible. And God has told us that people are in hell. I don't want to get bogged down in this debate, but it's an example of how it's an example of how they alienate people that could be their natural allies. It makes me want to say, stay away from me.
Well, and I don't think they're necessarily so like there'll be different places where like there'll be traditional, like there's a traditionalist forum where they'll like openly call their bishop, who's like a conservative bishop, like a heretic. You know what I mean? Or like I know I've been in different situations where I've been with like a diocesan bishop who will say, like in a kind of closed door conversation talking about like seminaries and things like this, who will say what his position is on the traditional Latin mass. And he'll say his position is the church says that you're allowed to worship that way. And I think if the church says you're allowed to worship that way, we should make a provision for people who want to worship that way. That's what he says in like the official meeting. And then like you'll hear the local sort of traditionalist community being like, oh, well, he's like opposed to us. They're opposed to this stuff and blah, blah, blah. And they'll be like, the bishop is somehow our enemy or opposed to us. And you'll be like, well, I was actually in a closed door meeting and that's not what he said, Right. And then they'll be like, oh, you don't expect me to believe that. And you want to be like, well, I mean, where did you get your information from? Because like I heard it directly, you know what I mean? And like the more difficult you make it to deal with you, you can say that the bishop has a duty to deal with you pastorally, and I suppose that's true. But just on the human side, we just know like some duties are easier to discharge than others, and maybe make the bishop's duty to deal with you pastorally an easier duty to discharge, and you may have better results.
Yeah, I don't put much stock in a movement that looks at, say, Bishop Robert Barron and say, oh, he's really liberal. He's not with us. He's terrible. He's an awful person. He didn't tell Ben Shapiro that he's going to burn in hell unless he converts to being a Catholic tomorrow. He didn't give Ben Shapiro an altar call. So therefore, blah, blah, blah. I mean, and that's a classic. I mean, if you go to that Ben Shapiro interview, there's a classic example. He does evangelize Ben Shapiro. The whole last half of the interview, he talks about how Jesus fulfills Judaism. And by the way, when Barron said that Jesus is the privileged way to salvation, what he meant was explicit water baptism and becoming an explicit Catholic is the privileged path to salvation. Because immediately after saying Christ is the privileged way, he says, but Christ is the only way. All grace comes through Christ. All salvation comes through Christ. So it's very clear what he meant in context by calling Jesus the privileged way. And yet the traditionalists look at that and say, oh, Barron is a hopeless Balthasarian universalist, religious indifferentist. I mean, that's what you're talking about here. You know what? That's just so wrong. And that's where they alienate their friends.
Yeah, and especially when you look at the like people who have done more to evangelize people. I mean, they're talking probably to like the most successful Catholic evangelist of the 21st century, like sort of our generation, like this historical moment. who actually has concrete results of converting people to Orthodox Catholicism, and who actually has concrete results of giving intellectual resources to people who are interested in Orthodox Catholicism. I mean, he's been a very successful communicator with a proven track record, and it's like his track record certainly has to count for something, you know?
Yeah. Well, I often say that his very right wing critics are not a they're not mad because his evangelizing methodology doesn't work. They're mad because it does.
Yeah,
You know,
no, that's kind
they
of true.
they see that he's successful and has a platform, and yet they just utterly dismiss his successes and say, well, he's more a force for modernism than he is for Catholicism. And so, you know, a pox on word on fire in his household. And once again, not to heap tons of coals on the traditionalists, because many of them
Yeah,
are my friends, and you know, they have their points to make, but there is a sense in which they are their own worst enemy. I wish they would know that.
yeah. Yeah, and it would be like, but if they foster a sense of like this kind of and the thing is that they kind of then like it's this weird back and forth thing because like they kind of do these little things that kind of verify the criticisms of their enemies, but then their enemies use that as a reason to like um crack down on them further, which just deepens their resentment, which strengthens their need to make those
Yeah, yeah,
criticisms, which then gives new and it's this back and forth cycle, and you just kind of want to say like, well, like you know,
yeah. You know, it
but
is.
speaking from the perspective of a traditionalist, you can't change your enemies, right? Like you're like if people don't like you, they're just not going to like you. But what you can change is like how you're going to deal with that. You just have to accept that situation as a given. They're just people who don't get you, and not only do they not get you, they don't like you. That's true. I don't think anybody wants to say they have real enemies and who want to do them harm and who
Yes, yes,
rejoice and take delight in watching them be harmed. Right? That's
yeah.
definitely true.
Which is
But
why. Go ahead.
but you can't change that. All you can do is change how you're going to act with regard to that. And what you're going to do is you're going to build bridges with people who are sort of your fellow travelers, and you're gonna
Yeah.
prove the invalidity of your opponent's criticisms.
And I think yeah, that is such wise, you know, that's just wisdom right there, because they're going to advance their cause a little bit more. But one of their criticisms, the traditionalists, and I think it's true, is that there seems to be an outsized concern over them on the part of the Vatican and certain hierarchs, where whereas it seems as if the bigger problem in the church, and I agree with this, the bigger problem in the
Yeah.
church is a kind of resurgence of a kind of progressive Catholic theology in the church now,
Oh yeah.
a strong latitudinarianism and these kinds of things. I think that is a graver danger in the church.
Whole national churches rejecting articles of the creed and traditional moral teaching in
Yeah,
toto. Yeah,
yeah,
like that would be more than like some just some random guy like writing a nasty post on Twitter every once in a while. You know what I mean?
yeah,
um I think the reason why is sometimes I think the reason why is because it's personal. You know what I mean? Like, and I feel like in the church you just have to get like if you're a leader in the church, you just have to kind of get over personal crit. Like if people make a crit, you should obviously take critique into account, right? And examine yourself
yeah,
against it, right? But like you just have to also realize like when you're in a position of leadership that yeah, not everybody's gonna like you. And so you know what? Like every pope that is a pope is going to have somebody writing something nasty about them on Twitter. You know what I mean?
yeah,
That's just life in the 21st century, right? If you got a pope who was exactly the opposite, like the inverse of Francis, there'd just be a different set of people writing nasty things about them on Twitter. There's 1.1 billion people in the church, and you can't direct your policy by like kind of striking out at people who write nasty posts, even if maybe they shouldn't be.
oh, so true, so true. And I mean, and all popes have to deal with these criticisms. I remember back in the day of John Paul II, you know, the seminary I was in had the National Catholic Reporter there, and there was a weekly column in the Reporter from Richard McBrien, another weekly column from Hans Kung, and it was just one endless diatribe against John Paul II. afternoon. I mean, that was the 1970s and 80s equivalent of Twitter to the National Catholic
right.
Reporter. That's where the criticisms showed up. So yeah, I mean, for example, if but it's important to keep the bonds of ecclesial communion. And I think that's an overarching theme of this conversation. No matter how critical we might be of Pope Francis for, in a sense, kind of balkanizing the church, muddying waters, dividing people instead of bringing people together. And in my case, at least, elevating the wrong people to positions of authority, and so on and so on and so forth. It is important to maintain the bonds of ecclesial communion, so that maybe the difference between me and some of these traditionalists advocating disobedience would be that if I got a letter from the Vatican tomorrow that said, "Dear Dr. Chap, it has come to our attention through Massimo Fagioli in America that certain blog posts and podcasts you've made on Gaudium et Spes 22 are beyond the pale. Therefore, we're ordering you to shut your blog down." I would do so. I would go to my computer and I would eliminate my blog and make it private at least, and wait until the day when I could do it again. Because I think that at that point, I'm a Catholic. This is ecclesial order that we have to pay attention to.
No, and I think that itself is a part of the tradition.
Exactly.
To do things like that. And I know sometimes I think too, like in the traditionalist movement, sometimes I think sometimes, since it's cut off from ecclesial communion, there's this kind of like echo chamber that turns things into like bigger problems than they actually are. Like, so for example, there'll be blow-ups periodically about like where there can't be a traditional Latin mass, but someone offers like a traditionally celebrated Novus Ordo, like in its stead, right? And people will like talk like this is the end of the world,
Yeah.
And look, like I understand the difference. Like, I've celebrated both forms of the liturgy. Like, I'm intimately familiar with how they're different, and I can totally see that. But like, at the same time, is like a traditionally celebrated Novus Ordo Mass like this like absolute catastrophe? And like, how did you talk yourself into like this is psychologically impossible to endure, like it's waterboarding or something,
Yeah.
like, how did you know what I mean? Or like there'll be people like, oh, but like going to a Novus Ordo Mass is like giving a pinch of incense to the emperor. And you want to be like, no, I don't think it is actually, but I think there's a lot of times people have sort of like talked themselves into that position, whereas like they may not have before. And like I said, I'm not saying that that's right. I'm not saying that that's fair. I'm not saying that, but like, is this really like the worst thing that's like imaginable that could happen? I mean, these are real first world problems that you have to go to like a conservative, traditionally celebrated Novus Ordo rather than like a traditional Latin mass.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I think sometimes these debates lose their sense of proportion.
Yeah. Or as I saw just a few months ago, for the first time, somebody referred to the Novus Ordo as, "I'll never attend the bogus Ordo." Yeah. And little things like that. Oh, come on. And in some ways, there's a contradiction involved in this critique of the Novus Ordo. On the one hand, they say the Novus Ordo has departed. The reason why we don't like it is it's departed from all the traditional elements of the liturgy. It's this completely new thing. It's a Protestantized liturgy. It's a liturgy made for modern people, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. So let's then reintroduce back into the Novus Ordo things like altar rails and more Latin and incense, sure, even ad orientem and some Gregorian chant and a trained choir and communion while kneeling. Oh, no. Because now you're just co-opting from the past. Now you're putting lipstick on that pig and you're acting like that counterfeit liturgy is the real thing. You can't. You can't win. In other words, you just can't win. The bottom line is, go ahead.
No. I think that's exactly right. And again, I understand the critique where people say like, like there are elements of the traditional Latin mass that sort of flow better. They flow in a certain way. There's a theological richness or something. But like, is the presence or absence of the prayers at the foot of the altar like whatever you think about the prayers or like the Tridentine offertory prayers versus the Novus Ordo offertory prayers. Like I can agree with you that the Tridentine offertory prayers are better than the Novus Ordo offertory prayers. But is that like and I get that they're better, but like is that the deal breaker? You know,
Yeah, yeah,
and even if it is a deal breaker for you, is it really helpful for you to like go out and like broadcast this and beat down the Novus Ordo liturgy? Like it's one thing to say, in my view, that if you're a traditionalist, it's one thing to say, in my view, the traditional Latin Mass is superior to the Novus Ordo for these reasons. And here's where I think that the liturgical reform lost its way. And this is why I prefer, given the choice between the traditional Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo, I'm going to support the traditional Latin Mass and work for its propagation. That's a perfectly legitimate position to hold,
yeah.
right?
Yeah. I know a lot
You
that are
know,
like that. Yeah,
yeah, and that's a perfect. But like, you can say all of that without having to go the bogus Ordo route and actively denigrate the Novus Ordo, because you've got to remember, um, it's still the Eucharist. It's still
yeah,
the worship of God. Now, that's not to say that I'm not trivializing saying that rite or solemnity is irrelevant, but it is subordinated to the mystery that's being celebrated and to the worship that we give to Almighty God. You know, and sometimes like to be like I just won't go to a Novus Ordo mass, because it's the Novus Ordo. Be like, well, it's the Eucharist. Like, is it really like is the rite of the Mass so hateful to you that like you can't experience the Eucharist? And what does that mean if that's true?
yeah. And
And I say this as someone who has to sit through crazy, who sat through my fair share of crazy liturgies. Like I had a period of time where I was going as a supply priest, out in different places, and like so you get to have like adventures in liturgy. Like you go down for the offertory to get the gifts, and they hand you a clipboard, and you don't know what to do with the clipboard. Like,
oh,
so
so
like
true.
so like I've had adventures in liturgy,
Oh,
and
I
like I
know.
get and so like and I get that, and I've sat through my fair share. But like at some point in time though, you do have to say, as much as aspects of this rite might grate on me, I do really, the Eucharist is important to me.
Yeah. Well, I want to build on that instead of let's move away from our critique of traditionalism
Sure.
and their critique of the Novus Ordo, and and emphasizing that it's a big church and that good things are happening in the church. The I'm going to dwell on something a little negative now, which is all that being true. There's still a lot of sap in that tree. There's a lot of life
Oh
in
yeah.
the church. The fact is, the church in the let's limit ourselves to the church in the United States is hemorrhaging people. It's
Hmm.
hemorrhaging millions of Catholics, especially young
Yeah.
Catholics. And there does seem to be a fairly high level of dissatisfaction with parish life, with the average parish,
Sure.
suburban, and the liturgy that goes with it. And I often say, I think one of the things that drew me to the Anglican ordinariate liturgy was the liturgy. But then my wife and I stayed because of the community. There was an ethos around it.
Sure.
Likewise, I think one of the things that draws people, especially parents with kids, to the traditional Latin Mass parishes
Absolutely.
isn't just the liturgy, but the community that is attracted
Absolutely.
by that liturgy. And so my thing is that the mainstream church in the United States, suburban America, has not done a good job of gripping people, of being existentially serious to them. And the liturgy is almost so banal, and the music is so awful that it just sort of communicates this mediocrity to people. So what do you think?
Well, I was actually a little bad. We had so I've done some work with the bishops conference and their commit their their subcommittee on the catechism, and they're one of the things that they're doing. It's interesting what they're doing, and they're doing some interesting work on what they're calling evangelizing catechesis, kind of recognizing this idea that like you don't have like Catholics who are committed to the faith who are coming to get systematic instruction in Christian doctrine, but like you have people who are questioning whether they believe, and so like they actually need to be evangelized as a part of their catechesis, right? So they're kind of the first phase of their like improving catechism was like solving that experience versus systematic debate, where like should catechism be experiential or should it be like a systematic instruction in Christian doctrine? And they won the systematic instruction in Christian doctrine debate won. But now we're kind of in the place where like it doesn't matter if there's systematic instruction in Christian doctrine, because like the people who come to it are basically unbelievers. Kids have decided I taught high school. By the junior year in high school, kids have decided whether they're believers. At any rate, so we were at this meeting, and the publishers, there are people who write catechetical texts, and I forget the context how it came up, but I told people, and there were some bishops at the meeting too, so it was a little subversive but fun, and I proposed to people the brunch test. Like what you have to do is you have to forget everything. Like, look, like I'm like committed, right? I signed up on the dotted line. I know about the Eucharist. I know even in an unimpressive parish why I'm there on Sunday, right? But like forget everything about being religious and just be a normal person, right? And you walk into a parish, and you have to ask yourself, well, why am I missing brunch for this? Is this better than bottomless mimosas? You know what I mean? No, right. But when you put it that way, like if you just look at what goes on this Sunday and you say like, is what am I getting here that I can't get drinking bottomless mimosas with my friends? And if you really want to be honest, if you look at a parish, the people, the millennials, and I guess now Generation Z people who go to brunch instead of going to church are making the right decision given the information that they have.
Oh, interesting.
So I think that's the first step, that you just have to admit it. Like I think you just have to admit that. Like the first, like step one of the 12 steps is to first admit that you have a problem.
That's right.
And so I think you just have to say like all these people who go to brunch instead of going to church, they absolutely made the right decision. Their practical reason is functioning. It is now obviously theologically, I know ex opere operato what happens with the Eucharist.
Well, no, right? People know what you're talking about. People know what you're talking about. So go ahead. No one's going to misunderstand you.
Okay, sure. But like I know that, but they don't know. And if you want to look, they made absolutely the right choice in deciding to go to brunch instead. Because like the values that they get of friendship, of communion, of like, relationships, that's a much better experience than what they're going to get at their church. And until you can sort of like just have that hit you like a ton of bricks and just sit with that feeling of failure for like a little bit. Like to me, that's like the first step in revitalizing things, is to just look at this and be like, the people who choose to go to brunch instead of this made the right choice.
Yeah, and I think one of the keys is that parishes need to do a better job of getting Catholics to find friends in their parishes. One of the reasons why choosing the brunch over mass is you might get a text message from 3 people that you work with, at work, who are you're really good friends with, because you're friends with people that you work with, and they say, hey, we're all meeting at this Mexican restaurant for margaritas, margarita Monday or Sunday morning, and come on down. And you're drawn to that because, that's where your community is. And is your community your parish, or is your community where you work, or at the gym where you work out, or that sort of thing? And for whatever reason, millions and millions of Catholics do not have friends in their parish. They come into the parish, as soon as mass is over, boom, they're out the door. It's parking lot bingo, everyone jockeying around, and then off to Perkins we go. And I don't know what the answer is. I'm not, everyone's always got advice for priests, and there's parishes need to do this, parishes need to do that. It's a function of the dysfunction of our culture in many ways as well. But it's a huge problem. I mean, one of the reasons that I go to the parish I go to is I have friends there now. My closest friends are there now.
Yeah.
And that's key.
I think friends are key, but maybe it's not the first step. Here's actually, since we're both John Paul II stands here, and we're both John Paul II fanboys. I actually like John Paul II better than I love Benedict. Don't get me wrong, but I love John Paul II is like my favorite pope.
Well, you're singing my song,
and,
yes.
But like, so he writes in, I think it's Novo Millennio in Eunte, so like one of these third millennium documents. I forget which one. I think that's the one. But at the end, he says, well, what are we supposed to do with what are we supposed to do to bring in the third? What program? And he's like, we don't need programs, is what he kind of says. And because this is what parish life is like. Implement this program or implement this thing.
Right.
Try this other thing. But like all those programs, they're church fun and they're lame and they only draw people who like church fun. So like you just have to admit that programs are dumb because the only people who like them are the kind of people who like doing workbooks and watching like videos and talking in small groups. And like, yeah, no one likes that. Well, I mean, some people do, but not many. And so like anytime someone proposes a program, it's always church fun and it always draws the people who like church fun, which is like 2% of the population. But like he says, we don't need a program. What we need, where we should start, is to contemplate the face of Jesus Christ.
Yes.
Right. And so I actually think like the way that you start, the first place you start is like with the cult, with the sense of mystery, And I think that's where, because like you're not going to have, the reason why you don't have community at the church is because nobody thinks that there's anything there that's worth spending their time there. But like when people are deeply committed to the same values, they discover other people who are committed to the values that they're committed to.
That's kind of my point that I'm making. Yeah, when you got your friends at work because your values are there. There's something you value there, that you're accomplishing something at work. But in the parish, it's like, well, let's just get this over with. I'm going to do my Jesus duty and I'm going to get out the door. And you're right. There has to be something there that grips, that says, yes, there's something here that I need and want.
Yeah, but like, when you have kind of like, gosh, this is okay. Well, I might as well, whatever. When you have Tammy and when you have like what Tammy and Bob like playing the tambourine and strumming on Eagles Wings on the guitar, and like Father Chuck kind of just like up there, just like just saying like secular bromides, and like this guy, what's the point? But like, it seems to me like the way to start renewing parish life is to start with a more sort of a liturgy that contemplates and adores, like a liturgy that's focused on the holy mystery, and then I guess in some part of the order of preachers, like a kind of preaching that like shows people how their lives are connected to the holy mystery, like, because like that's the thing, because like you can't like even the catechetical component comes later. The first component comes with showing people like, why are you here? Because there's a holy mystery. This is actually what, since we were being critical of traditionalists, this is actually what traditionalists get right. I mean, one of the reasons why they have,
I was just about to say that this is what this is their point.
I mean, there's a bit of a selection bias because it's intentional Catholics a lot of times who go to the traditional liturgy. But nevertheless, when you go to the traditional mass, forget questions about liturgical reform. I don't care whether you're progressive or whatever your liturgical opinion. Nobody has ever said this is lame. Nobody's ever said something. When you go to the traditional Latin Mass, whether it's a simple low Mass, whether it's a solemn high Mass, it is undeniable that the people there think that something significant is happening.
But you're right. I mean, it's intentional. The fact is, and I say this, we can have communities of powerful Catholic faith that draws people there because they believe, with a Novus Ordo liturgy that's done beautifully and connects us to the
Sure.
transcendent. I often say
Sure.
to people, if you go back to the preconciliar church, and what is now the extraordinary form of the liturgy was the only form of the liturgy, essentially, with some
Yeah.
exceptions, right? Like the Dominican rite.
Yeah.
The fact is, the vast majority of liturgies done in parishes were just as slipshod as anything you see today. Something has to account for the fact for why. At the end of the Second Vatican Council in the late 1960s, Catholic culture collapsed almost overnight. If the
Sure.
preconciliar Catholic Church was so strong, so vibrant, so filled
This
with
is true.
Catholics gripped by the faith, and that liturgy had so nourished them, why did the nuns all throw off their habits? Why did priests leave by the thousands? Why did people start divorcing and contracepting? Why did they stop coming to church almost overnight? If that was what their faith was. And the fact is, it was, and if that mass were to ever become the ordinary form of the liturgy once again, you would run into exactly the same problem: slipshod liturgies, a bunch of Catholics who are just there out of some sense of obligation or duty, not necessarily
Sure.
intentional. Anyway, I'm ranting now, but go
Well,
ahead.
well, sure. One thing, maybe to push back a little bit. One thing that the traditional mass has for it, though, is that there's sort of like protections against sloppy celebration, right? So like even if you celebrate like a sloppy low mass, right? Like there's still a certain amount of transcendence there just by carrying out the rite.
All right. Well,
You know what I mean?
sloppy's
Like
not the right word. Sloppy's not the right word, but it wouldn't have been
sure.
unusual, for example, to go to a Sunday liturgy and it's 25 minutes long.
Oh yeah. No, but I would say this is that maybe like a 25-minute old like low mass is still going to be it's going to be less sort of it's going to still evoke more of a sense of a mystery than a 55-minute Novus Ordo with Father Chuck.
Well, that I agree with.
You see what I mean? I think
Father Peter, I grew up with the Father Chucks of the world, so you are absolutely, yeah, you've just knocked it out of the park with that one. That's true.
And well, you know what I mean. So there was a lot of unglamorous liturgy before the council, and I think that actually contemporary traditionalists, this is one thing that they're not interested in restoring before the council, is that kind of slipshod liturgy. But one thing it does is just from the perspective of someone who celebrates the traditional rite, if you just because it tells you what to, like, it gives you all of the steps for what to do, and you don't really have, I mean, down to like where you put the burse, whatever. So like what that means is that even if you rush through the thing, you know what I mean? There's a limit to how badly you can like just offend people's sensibilities with your poor Ars Celebrandi, whereas like what maybe one of the criticisms of the Novus Ordo is like your ability to offend people with your Ars Celebrandi is unlimited.
The fact is, that's true. And you're a conscientious guy, so you pay attention to the rubrics. But the idea that priests ignore the rubrics is simply something that happened with the Novus Ordo is false. There were priests that ignored the rubrics in the old liturgy as well. And I know that, old priests, I know old priests, and they say that, yeah, there was a time. And I was in seminary, I knew all these old priests that, had celebrated the Latin Mass through all of their youthful priesthood. And they said, I knew priests that would skip this and skip that. And because their attitude was nobody in the pews knows what's going on here anyway. So what the heck? So in other words, I'll push back a little bit on your pushback in the sense that I do think that there were sloppy liturgies even before the council, but but I'll agree with this. Not as many as there are now. And there were safeguards in the old. I'm not here to trash the old mass. I wish it would.
Yeah.
May it flourish. May it bloom a million times over around the world, because I do love it. I'm trying to hit at that traditionalist sort of romantic revivification of the past. If we could just bring this mass back, the pews would be full again. And
well, this is, and maybe we could mention this in a second, but like, this is actually the kind of point, like, I think a lot of those critiques of Vatican II misunderstand the whole dynamics of secularism. But you made an earlier point about how, like, if the pre-Vatican II church was so healthy, how come it collapsed so fast? I just had thought, I recently read an essay by Father Peter Stravinskas think that's how you say his name. It's one of those
Father, yeah,
Lithuanian
Father.
names.
I've met Father Peter Stravinskas back in my day.
Yeah. So it was this essay, and he was kind of complaining about how everybody complains about boomer priests being like liberals. And as a boomer priest who's not a liberal, he says this kind of bothers me a little bit, right? And he's like because like I was in seminary, and you want to know who all the people were. We want to know who all the people were who were causing all the problems. It wasn't the boomers. We were the ones suffering from all the problems.
Yes.
It was the greatest generation, silent generation priests, who were formed in the old system, who now under the new system were pushing all this other stuff. And it was the boomer priests, and he named some other, kind of boomer priests in his sort of circle. It was the boomer priests who had to endure it. And it was the boomer priests who laid down the foundations after the council for a more kind of healthy John Paul II style Catholicism.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when I was growing up in the late 60s and 70s and going through things like the priest removing the holy water during Lent and replacing the holy water with a cactus in the holy water font and stuff like that, and then doing all kinds of liturgical shenanigans, and then literally I heard homilies saying, that you can pray your rosaries if you want, but it's kind of a passe devotion. Those were priests trained in the pre-conciliar church. All right, those were not boomer priests.
Yeah, and I imagine you mentioned like if you were in the seminary in 1978. That would be the generation of most of your seminary.
Oh, absolutely. And fortunately, I went to a very conservative seminary, minor, 78. I was in minor seminary. It doesn't exist anymore, Northern Kentucky. It was a very conservative seminary. So the seminary to me was like heaven because it was a safe haven. I mean, the craziness was that. The craziness was in the catechetics and the preaching and the liturgies and I grew up in a very conservative diocese in Lincoln, Nebraska, and yet it was not immune from Father Twinkletoes doing his thing, right? It wasn't immune from that. And anyway, we could go on with stories like that all day long. There is therefore, and maybe we can sort of wrap it up and end with this. There is a generational thing. As I get older, and I'm 65 now, I realize that the generational perspectives and the differences between them are quite real. And I sometimes, speak to some traditionalists and talk to them about, when I was young, I knew priests that were trained in the pre-conciliar church and they were nuts. And they look at me like, well, like I'm crazy. Like that can't be right. And I'm thinking, well, that's because their experience of the church is different from mine.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's important to kind of look at different generations, and you'll kind of notice this, especially with maybe some of these silent generation priests that we kind of like were talking about earlier. Is sometimes people think like their generational experience was normative. I think this is what you're seeing with like the old guards or silent generation priests who are still around, who have late in light had a little bit of a reviviscence in their career, maybe under the current pontificate. And what you kind of see is they interpret their own generational experience as if it's normative for every generation. But the problem with that is not only did they go through like the Vatican II period in the church, but they went through a huge cultural shift in the cultural society, where like they kind of grew up in the Catholic system, but they grew up in a world that was more sort of like open from the Catholic system, and that experience of being opened up to the world kind of shaped, and it happened right during their formative years, that shaped their outlook. And I think sometimes what they tend to do is they tend to think that particular historical moment is how everybody else or younger generations see things. It's actually not true. So with millennial and Generation Z Catholics, people don't see it as the two things that they don't see. They don't see they didn't have like that old Catholic culture, and then their experience of modernity isn't something as liberating, right? So if you're a Catholic of a certain generation, like for you grew up in the old system, and then like you experienced like modernity is like marching for civil rights with Dr. Martin Luther King, perhaps some forms of protest against the Vietnam War, perhaps
Yeah.
even some. I mean, the sexual revolution in toto is a disaster. But I suppose that there's a certain amount of like loosening up of sexual mores that was probably a little bit healthy, or at least could be experienced as liberating, I suppose.
Well,
Um,
something like if a 17-year-old girl in a Catholic school gets pregnant, she doesn't have to run off and be
oh
sent
yeah,
to
yeah,
live with her Aunt
right.
Matilda.
Yeah, no, things like that. And so they experience that as liberating. But remember, both of those things, like that experience of modernity and that experience of the old Catholic culture, are not something that millennial and Generation Z Catholics have. What millennial and Generation Z Catholics have is they have nothing, and then they have the experience of modernity that's much more radical, right? So, like, what would have been really radical, like if you were in the 1960s, is like a woman went to live with her boyfriend before they were married, and that was like, oh my gosh, the end of it. No, I mean, obviously it's still wrong, but
Yeah.
like that was like really outre in the 60s. But like if you're like a millennial or a Generation Z Catholic, you're now like looked at as a big weirdo for not doing that. You know, you just think about issues with like sexuality or like the hookup culture on college campuses or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Modernity has progressed a lot more, and people didn't have that experience of the Catholic culture. So what happens is with millennial and Generation Z Catholics is there's no such thing as a cradle Catholic anymore. Every Catholic is a convert.
Oh, that is so true. And I think
And
that's probably a great way to maybe end this and wrap this up, is to
sure,
say, that we're dealing with now a different generational reality where every Catholic, no matter how devoted they now are in some sense reverts, or they're either converts or reverts.
sure, yeah. And so they don't necessarily, and the people who do come back to the church don't necessarily experience modernity as liberating. In fact, the people who come back to the church came back to the church because they made a deliberate decision against modernity.
Which is why the church needs to show that, to be that alternative, not to mold. And see, this is, we're right back to square one, where my criticisms of the current pontificate to a certain extent
Yeah,
do square a little bit with the more traditionalist side of things, in the sense that we don't need the church to smell and look more like the world. We've tried that. We did
yeah.
that.
Well,
That's
and you,
that's the beige Catholicism that Robert Barron talks about. We
yeah.
need to be the alternative.
And you see the recycling, you see kind of the recycling, like this new in diatrismo thing is just the recycling. It's odd because it's like it's odd to have like 80-year-old men tell 30-year-old men or 30-year-old men and women that like
Yeah.
an ideology from 60 years ago is new and their ideology is old fashioned. Um, like that's weird. But you see, like it's because they think in that terms of indiatrismo and like history moves forward. They're still stuck thinking that their cultural moment is normative for everybody, but like they don't see it that way. If in fact, if we're going to be Hegelian about history, we shouldn't like think of like younger Catholics as trying to turn back the clock or whatever. We should actually think of like the dialectic as moving into its next phase.
Well, yeah,
We're the
exactly.
post-Vatican II.
I mean,
We're like,
Pope Francis is 87 years old. So he's got his generational blinders as well. And so when he says things like, I'm not on board with the Indiatrismos, the backwardists, well, I think he's conjuring up images of these intransigent 1950s style finger
yeah,
wagging, moralizing. And where is that church today? I want to say,
yeah.
where,
And
and
he
like,
and he's and he's thinking like his thing is the openness. But like the problem is that this is the exact same ideology from 60 years ago. And really, I think
yeah,
what's more happening is like, like that old thing that Francis is criticizing was kind of like the thesis. Francis's uh Francis's point of view is kind of like the antithesis. And what you're seeing is now like both of those perspectives are being sublated, in like this new generation. So they're not so much trying to bring something old back, but they're kind of like moving beyond the tension between
yeah,
those earlier
exactly.
two instances.
They are. And the irony is that, people of a certain older generation look at things like the Latin Mass and traditional devotions, and we say, oh, and they say, oh man, I thought the church got beyond. And the fact is, these things are now so old and so out of the experience of average young Catholics today that it seems new. It's that it's so esoteric to them that it seems like this strange new weird thing
Yeah.
that's kind of attracting to them. It's like big fat ties that I still have in my closet from the 19th, big fat paisley ties. Will they ever come back into style again? Well, they might, just because people will forget, that Herb Tarlick wore them back in the
Well,
70s.
no. No. And this is the thing, and you kind of see this with like younger people. They don't like they just don't even understand the debate. So even somebody who, even like a younger, like Generation Z, say Generation Z Catholic, who doesn't particularly have a love for the Latin Mass, just can't even understand why you would be like opposed to it. Like they can't even understand the debate anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, in that generation. And you know what, the actual thing that actually kind of emerges now, because people made a choice, because they're converts who made a choice for Catholicism and against modernity, not trying to not trying to straddle their cultural Catholic upbringing with the progress of modernity, but because they chose for tradition. There you actually see this weird, it's not weird, it's actually perfectly sensible, of I guess we're calling it now. What are we calling it? We're calling it tradismatic. I wanted to call it Trentecostal, but I think tradismatic won out. But like
Yeah.
you'll see like active Generation Z Catholics who have no problem with like praise and worship stuff, but who also want mass ad orientem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who want mass ad orientem, and want Gregorian chant too. And like to them, like the idea that you have to choose between those two, or that there's anything even like contradictory about liking both, just doesn't even make sense to them. They're like, I like one because it meets in my devotional needs, it meets my cultural sort of expectations.
Yeah.
But I also like the tradition and heritage of my faith, and I can't even understand why you wouldn't.
Oh, amen. Amen. That is so true. I think that is a good summary of where so many young Catholics, by young, I would say anyone under the age of 30, 35 or so, where they are. Hey, look, we've been at this about an hour and 25, hour and a half, so we should probably kind of wrap this up now, and maybe look towards part two someday. I don't know,
All
but
right.
it's been great talking to you, getting to know you.
Yeah,
like I said,
likewise.
I enjoyed your Facebook posts, and you didn't disappoint. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Schapp.
Yeah,
All
thank
right.
you, and thanks everyone for listening today, and say some prayers for Father Peter as he works on his doctoral dissertation.
Please.
All right.
Please.